The Whig Interpretation of History by Herbert Butterfield, published in 1931. Introduction. It has been said that the historian is the avenger, and that standing as a judge between the parties and rivalries and causes of bygone generations, he can lift up the fallen and beat down the proud, and by his exposures and his verdicts, his satire and his moral indignation, can punish unrighteousness, avenge the injured, or reward the innocent. One may be forgiven for not being too happy about any division of mankind into good and evil, progressive and reactionary, black and white, and it is not clear that moral indignation is not a dispersion of one's energies to the great confusion of one's judgment. There can be no complaint against the historian who personally and privately has his preferences and antipathies, and who, as a human being, merely has a fancy to take part in the game that he is describing. It is pleasant to see him give way to his prejudices, and take them emotionally, so that they splash into color as he writes, provided that when he steps in this way into the arena, he recognizes that he is stepping into a world of partial judgments and purely personal appreciations, and does not imagine that he is speaking ex cathedra. But if the historian can rear himself up like a god and judge, or stand as the official avenger of the crimes of the past, then one can require that he shall still be more godlike and regard himself rather as the reconciler than as the avenger, taking it that his aim is to achieve the understanding of the men and parties and causes of the past, and that in this understanding, if it can be complete, all things will ultimately be reconciled. It seems to be assumed that in history we can have something more than the private points of view of particular historians, that there are verdicts of history, and that history itself, considered impersonally, has something to say to men. It seems to be accepted that each historian does something more than make a confession of his private mind in whimsicalities, and that all of them are trying to elicit a truth, and perhaps combining through their various imperfections to express a truth, which, if we could perfectly attain it, would be the voice of history itself. But if history is in this way something like the memory of mankind, and represents the spirit of man brooding over man's past, we must imagine it as working not to accentuate antagonisms, or to ratify old party cries, but to find the unities that underlie the differences, and to see all lives as part of the one web of life. The historian trying to feel his way towards this may be striving to be like a god, but perhaps he is less foolish than the one who poses as God the Avenger. Studying the quarrels of an ancient day, he can at least seek to understand both parties to the struggle, and he must want to understand them better than they understood themselves. Watching them entangle in the net of time and circumstance, he can take pity on them, these men who, perhaps, had no pity for one another. And though he can never be perfect, it is difficult to see why he should aspire to anything less than taking these men and their quarrels into a world where everything is understood and all sins are forgiven. It is astonishing to what an extent the historian has been Protestant, progressive, and Whig, and the very model of the 19th century gentleman. Long after he became a determinist, he retained his godly role as the dispenser of moral judgments, and like the disciples of Calvin, he gave up none of his right to moral indignation, even when he himself has been unsympathetic to the movements of his own generation, as in the case of Hallam, who bitterly opposed the great reform bill and trembled to think of the revolutionary ways into which the country was moving. Something in his constitution still makes him lean to what might be called the Whig interpretation of history, and he refuses historical understanding to men whose attitude in the face of change and innovation was analogous to his own. It might be argued that our general version of the historical story still bears the impress that was given to it by the great patriarchs of history writing, so many of whom seem to have been Whigs and gentlemen, when they have not been Americans. And perhaps it is from these that our textbook historians have inherited the top hat and the pontifical manner, and the grace with which they hand out a consolation prize to the man who, though a reactionary, was irreproachable in his private life. But whether we take the contest of Luther against the popes, or that of Philip II and Elizabeth, or that of the Huguenots with Catherine de' Medici, whether we take Charles I versus his parliaments, or the younger Pitt versus Charles James Fox, it appears that the historian tends in the first place to adopt the Whig or Protestant view of the subject, and very quickly busies himself with dividing the world into the friends and enemies of progress. It is true that this tendency is corrected to some extent by the more concentrated labors of historical specialists, but it is remarkable that in all the examples given above, as well as in many others, the result of detailed historical research has been to correct very materially what had been an accepted Protestant or Whig interpretation. Further, this Whig tendency is so deep rooted that even when piecemeal research has corrected the story in detail, we are slow in revaluing the whole and reorganizing the broad outlines of the theme in the light of these discoveries. And what Monsieur Romier has deplored in the historians of the Huguenots might fairly be imputed in those other fields of history, that is, the tendency to patch the new research into the old story, even when the research in detail has altered the bearings of the whole subject. We cling to a certain organization of historical knowledge, which amounts to a Whig interpretation of history, and all our deference to research brings us only to admit that this needs qualifications in detail. But exceptions in detail do not prevent us from mapping out the large story on the same pattern all the time. These exceptions are lost indeed in that combined process of organization and abridgment, by which we reach our general survey of general history. And so it is over large periods, and in reference to the great transitions in European history, that the Whig view holds hardest and holds longest. It is here that we see the results of a serious discrepancy between the historical specialist and what might be called the general historian. The truth is that there is a tendency for all history to veer over into Whig history, and this is not sufficiently explained if we merely ascribe it to the prevalence and persistence of a traditional interpretation. There is a magnet forever pulling at our minds, unless we have found the way to counteract it. And it may be said that if we are merely honest, if we are not also carefully self-critical, we tend easily to be deflected by the first fundamental fallacy. And though this may even apply in a subtle way to the detailed work of the historical specialist, it comes into action with increasing effect the moment any given subject has left the hands of the student in research. For the more we are discussing and not merely inquiring, the more we are making inferences instead of researches, then the more Whig our history becomes, if we have not severely repressed our original error. Indeed, all history must tend to become more Whig in proportion as it becomes more abridged. Further, it cannot be said that all faults of bias may be balanced by work that is deliberately written with the opposite bias. For we do not gain true history by merely adding the speech of the prosecution to the speech for the defense. And though there have been Tory, as there have been many Catholic, partisan histories, it is still true that there is no corresponding tendency for the subject itself to lean in this direction. The dice cannot be secretly loaded by virtue of the same kind of original unconscious fallacy. For this reason, it has been easy to believe that Clio herself is on the side of the Whigs.